I'm actually just glancing at little profile pictures of everyone tonight on the speaking circuit. Jamie, you're there on the front lines when people are like literally in crisis and reaching out through text. And then Dale, you are there to try to change the cultural landscape and get men to understand the fact that this is their issue. Colleen and I are there to try to change the leadership stats so that when more women are in leadership, a lot of these things self-correct. And then Midwin, you are the one reporting from the legal front lines and helping understand like when things do go wrong or how to protect people so they don't. I mean, I'm just so aware of like this spectrum of this issue that it takes all of these levels of intervention and intersection. I'm really hopeful that some of the questions from our listeners and even some of the comments from the rest of the panelists can talk about like what does responsible corporate leadership look like around this issue.
I'm loving this discussion because 3 years ago when the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, I'd been speaking out about sexual harassment in our industry and in business generally for years before Me Too. And I'd spoken out publicly because nobody else ever would. And as a result, over the years, a lot of women had written to me about instances, and I had always tried to persuade them to tell their stories, and I never could, because understandably, they were scared shitless, quite rightly, of retaliation, that they would never work in this industry again. So when the New York Times broke the Harvey Weinstein saga, and a ton of incredibly brave women stood up and spoke out, I just posted on Facebook and I said, women of the advertising industry, the time is now to name names. And I posted my email address and I said, email me and I will connect you with trusted reporters in our industry who can break those stories. I absolutely did not expect the avalanche that hit my inbox. I heard from women and men in the advertising industry from all around the world, actually, because as the responses started coming, our trade press picked up on this. Understandably, the women and the men who've written to me are too frightened to speak out because the powerful men doing the harassing are the gatekeepers of everything. They're the gatekeepers of jobs, promotions, raises, awards, whether or not you get to go to Cannes, whether or not you get the good briefs, and nobody will speak up. The names I heard were the names of men that I thought were good, men who are friends and who to this day have not been exposed. Our industry harbors an amazing number of serial rapists. Our industry harbors stories you would not believe because they still haven't been told. And so I especially want to say to the men in the audience, we need you because we need you to stand up to other men. We need you to report to other men. We need you to intervene and to step in and help women who are being harassed by other men. And we need you to tell other men that this is completely unacceptable. And we need you to make sure that this stops happening in our industry.
That was so powerful.
You know what is a question, I guess, that I would have for Dale? When I have one-on-one spoken to men in our industry, either who have been perpetrators or who are around them, it's sort of the ones who are doing it are just completely out to lunch as to the power that they yield. So, they're shocked to find out that the women who are coming to speak to them after work or trying to get 10 minutes on their calendar for coffee or, buying them a drink at a bar, it's because they as employees want some feedback from their boss. They want to be part of the group. They want to have the one-on-one. They want to be seen. And these guys are completely oblivious to the fact that, despite the fact that they were probably nerds in high school, they suddenly are sexually appealing to every single woman in their office. And then the other flip side of that, just aghast at it. They really think that they all of a sudden turned into some kind of magnet for women when they got power, and they don't equate their perception of what women want from them. And the other one is the men. I can't tell you, and Cindy, maybe you have thoughts on this, but how many men say, I just didn't even know it was happening? And it's like, really? Really?
To So here's the interesting thing, Colleen, because when I realized back in the fall of 2017 that it was going to be really difficult to get women to speak up, I set out to guilt the men of our industry. And the trade press helped me put this call out. I said, men of the advertising industry who stood by, watched, said nothing, stayed silent, laughed, joined in, now is your chance to be able to look yourself in the mirror every morning. Come forward with what you know, because you were there, you saw it. And actually that worked. A number of men wrote to me, and a couple of interesting things about this. I mean, first of all, the men were just as scared shitless about retaliation. And bear in mind that I was getting emails from all around the world, including parts of the world where some men were actually genuinely afraid for their lives if they reported on the powerful men in that particular region. So they were terrified. And then there was also a number of men where the flip side of sexual harassment is bullying and abuse.
Yeah.
There were men who were actually also utterly emotionally traumatized by bad behavior that had been meted out to them. It was not sexual. And by the way, I absolutely heard also from men who'd been sexually harassed by powerful gay men. But I'm talking about, in this case, where the ECD, who is sexually harassing and raping women, is also bullying and abusing the men who report into him. And the interesting thing there is, I communicated with men who were utterly broken by what they've been put through, but they did not go to HR because our societal construct of masculinity would not allow belief that a man could be that traumatized by another man. And men were terrified of appearing emasculated in terms of making that complaint. There are a ton of men who absolutely know what was going on, were aware. I mean, a number of them, by the way, are complicit, but others also were terrified, and others actually had their own trauma, which they didn't feel they could speak up about because nobody would believe them.
Yeah, so thank you for saying, well, everything you've said. There's a compound effect behind the man box. This is what we tend to call the version of masculinity that keeps men confined in isolation with their trauma and pain, and who never reach out for help and all that kind of stuff. The compound effect of that is that actually, in fact, feminism would free men from that man box as well.
Yep, absolutely.
And the man box is so powerful because it keeps men from going against the man team, because you get your man card revoked and suddenly you're not manly enough. And one of the biggest pieces of social capital that men have is being part of the man team. So the trick is, how do we tear that down whilst gaining some form of fraternity? Like, we'd love to have brotherhood with people who care about us and want to be there for us, but how do we discern when it's been so warped what masculinity is? So there's this compound effect, which is why so much of what we're doing in this wave of feminism is discussing what is masculinity, because we have to deal with it. We have to deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a healthier way so that men can start to come out with women and do the good work, right? I think so much of what we're seeing right now is change. It's really ugly. It's hard, but it's so important. And I hear a lot of men, I'll give you a quick example. I went into a Fortune 100 international multi-billion-dollar telecom company, and I did a workshop there with senior leadership. And I asked the men in the room, like, how are we doing in this company with representation? And they said, well, it feels like our company's doing pretty well. They've cited that they had a visible president and vocal female leader, and they did. They had one. They had one woman at the executive level. And I started to show them the numbers. Their talent pipeline was skewed really heavily toward men. The men in that room, and this is true, most of the men in that room were honestly shocked. They just didn't see it. And we started to break down what's going on. And one of the things that happened is that once we went from shame on you for not knowing this, we went from shame to, okay, this is a problem, let's get constructive about fixing it. The men got on board really quickly. And one of the things that was beautiful that happened in concert was that one of the guys in that room admitted, hey, I'm a single father. I have 3 daughters. Sometimes it's really hard for me in this role to see what I see and be around the men I'm around. And it's really, it's hard for me to get home to my kids. And just saying, hey, I got to go take care of my daughter, sometimes I catch flack for that. He admitted that the man box is kind of what was holding him back from being the kind of man who would see this in their company. And it just paired really sort of nicely. So So in that moment, he admitted that there's some tears in the room. These are hard people. These are business professionals. Tears in the room saying, how do we change this thing? And by the end of a 4-hour workshop, they had changed multiple policies, and within 6 months, they had moved the right direction by 10 percentage points. I mean, change is possible. And to Cindy's point, there are a lot of men, I think, who are willing to get involved once they realize that they're unconsciously part of this issue, and therefore they're part of the solution.
This is so thought-provoking in terms of, I hope that everyone that joined here tonight, we're looking for what are the next steps. And Dale, what you've described is sometimes what I've also experienced in some of 3%'s consulting services, which is you have to create and carve out time and a safe place where men can ask rookie questions and risk being wrong and risk not knowing. And it's so not in the leadership playbook to be in that space energetically of kind of, just not having all the answers and not being so definitive. And it's in those moments where you can get men to kind of disarm them a little. And I guess the question to this group is like, can that be done at scale? And in the absence of it being done at scale, I just don't see how we solve this fast enough to offer true support to the collateral damage, which is so many women, their careers and their aspirations, which it's just not okay any longer.
Yeah, and I think, Kat, to your point about doing it at scale, I think that's one of the hardest parts about structural and human challenges like this. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is that there are so many groups, entities, practices that are coming at this in so many ways that, to me, when I think about getting to it fast enough and getting to it to your point, sort of at that scale level, it comes in a collaborative way where everyone's coming at this, whether it's Dale and the work that he's doing or 3% or Time's Up. So many different facets of this getting tackled from different perspectives. And I think to Cindy's point, it's a lot more storytelling and public visibility around this that isn't necessarily, I think to Dale's point, moving away from the shame, and visibility is really important. And then also paths forward, because I don't think there are often stories of sort of we see the Harvey Weinstein opening the bathrobe sort of stories, and what we see at Empower Work is that often those stories make someone minimize their experience. Like, well, my boss isn't opening his bathrobe in front of me, so it's like not that bad. Right. I think we need stories of all different pervasive levels of what's going on. And we also need positive stories of how things are handled and approaches, to your point about, what are companies doing? How are they need to be taken out of these private spaces and shown, like, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to explore these questions if you're the dad of 3, and you're grappling with this. So I think it's the storytelling from all fronts, and then that collective action from all the different organizations, entities, policymakers, lawyers that are working on all of this. That's how I think we're going to get to a larger change.
I think you make a very good point about what sexual harassment actually looks like. And it can look like so many different things that some people just are not even cognizant of the fact that they're being sexually harassed. It could be something as, again, an unwanted touching, but yet the unwanted touching is just a sort of rubbing of the shoulder, something like that. And the more people come forward, the more it gives others confidence to identify what they're going through. So that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. This has come up a couple times tonight, but men are also the victim of this in various ways. And there was a story, Brandon Fraser, the actor that was in Tarzan, he was the victim of sexual assault and harassment by a famous director, and he wrote about it after years and years and years of silence. And it's this excruciating account. I think it was in Vanity Fair, but I remember when I read it, it took my breath away, because he described the moment when this man crossed the boundary with him in a public place as feeling like someone had thrown invisible paint on on him. And I just thought that was the most beautiful expression of how your personhood can be negated in a moment. And it reminded me very much about what Kirsten Imhoff from Pretty Bird talked about on our stage at 3% at being at Cannes with a bunch of male leaders and finally meeting someone she had kind of revered, a male leader, and she introduced herself, and he said in front of all these other men, "Oh, I thought the first time I met you, your feet would be behind your ears." Do you remember that moment, Colleen, at the conference? It was so powerful.
I do.
I mean, she was so enamored of this man's career, and here she's addressing him with like effusive like admiration and friendship in front of all these other men in this setting that's supposed to honor the best friends, and he reduces her in that one moment, in that one comment, to just like a sex doll.
That is so pervasive in this industry, Kat. You know that. In that moment, he said, "Oh, you don't belong here. Don't forget why you're here. Oh, you're what? I just see you as this thing." And it all falls away, and you're standing there in a group of men at a place where you're so happy you finally made it to, and that happens, and they're all the same. I have heard, don't go out giving blowjobs tonight. You've got a big presentation tomorrow. I have heard, "I like that necklace. I'll hold on to it while I fuck you from the back." I have heard, I have heard everything. I have heard everything. And it's all in the line of, and the whole room, half the room will go, and the rest will look down uncomfortably. But there's always the group that will go, ha, 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 ha. And you're like,
I would have
laughed me out of the room.
I would have, because my response would, no, honey, no.
But
no.
I wish I could say it. I mean, this happens to very outspoken women.
Mm-hmm. That's where, we talk about men and male allies, but I really think men have to be more than allies at this point. Like, there's got to be a sense of really infiltration, of breaking down, of really being part of building and changing a complete, like, it's not allyship anymore, it's frontline work. It's women have been doing so much more of this work than we have. It's our turn to get in there and do the work.
It's funny, what's the famous quote by RBG? "I don't want anything from you but to get your foot off my neck." And I know the time that she said that in. And yes, in many, many ways. I mean, I'm 55 years old. That's my sentiment too. I don't need anything. Just stop sitting on me. But the truth is, what you're saying is that actually we do have to get to the place where we go, yeah, I need your help actually. Because I'm outnumbered here, or I'm the other here, or I'm the woman of color here, or I need your help. You have power that you should be spending on my behalf, and that's what makes us equal, when you give that away. And I think that doesn't happen enough, and I know there are men out there that would do that. Mm-hmm. I know there are ones that do already,
Yeah, I think what happens is a lot of men get into this thing of defending our intention. Like, I was joking.
I didn't mean it like that.
Yeah. When actually I think what we have to switch to, and this takes work, but I think we have to switch to, what was my impact? The impact is the more important thing to understand here.
Yeah.
There's so much leeway. I think my experience with women in the workplace is that I have had so much leeway given to me, so much benefit of the doubt given to me. And the learning I have grown in all those ways is like, I don't actually know my impact sometimes, and my intention is good most of the time, all the time really, but really, women have done so much of that bridge building. I think men have got to meet them halfway. Like, we've got to do the work.
Right. And one thing that I also counsel my clients, because a lot of times they come to me while still employed and while still undergoing the harassment. And one of the things that I start to tell them too is to start making sure that they're documenting everything, and that they're going to HR, but also it's important to sort of assert themselves and talk back. And again, not just women, men as well. So, for example, the example you just gave, well, I was just joking. I find that a lot of people will do that when they have been caught out there, or when they, when someone has sort of singled them out or pointed out bad behavior, and this sort of rush to, well, I was just joking. And it's important to just remind people, well, this is a workplace. This is an improv night. This ain't stand-up comedy night. Ain't nobody here to joke. You know what I mean? Like, this is a workplace.
Right.
That is fantastic.
You can imagine how hard it is when your work is to make jokes.
Right.
The line gets blurry so fast.
Right.
But you're right. It's not like it is a place of work.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to remind people, like, sometimes you just have to be like, no, we're not here for that. When you start to get familiar with your colleagues, and then you start thinking it's okay to turn on the porn on the work computer, things like that. That too is creating a hostile work environment. And it's important for folks, I always tell them, to remind people, listen, this is a workplace. If you want to watch that after work. We're not here for that.
Yeah, I mean, Midwin, I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the thought starter questions that the Fishbowl team surfaced to me this afternoon was about how does this kind of new COVID work from home environment change or contribute to these dynamics? And I remember as I read that thinking, well, for Jeffrey Toobin, you think, oh, people are working from home, how much are they being harassed? But I don't know. It seems like it's bringing up almost new levels of what work code of conduct needs to be.
I totally agree, Kat, and I think it's moving into other areas, and I think also the channels then for addressing it also become more challenging. So, for example, we've had folks reaching out to us who were going through something amidst COVID, and then trying to elevate it or escalate it through various channels becomes more challenging. It's like you're jumping, instead of in a closed room, maybe having a supportive conversation with HR where you're reporting, you're suddenly on a Zoom call, and it's like maybe you're getting disconnected in the midst of sharing something really sensitive, or whatever it is. It changes the dynamic of support and availability, as well as the comfort with elevating it. On the flip side, I think some of it increases the opportunity to Midwin's point, documentation. So, there are folks who are like, oh, I just got this over, Slack message, or, the Jeffrey Toobin thing. It's like, well, you can grab there's a screen grab of that. Documentation changes quite a bit, I think, amidst all of this.
I was just hired recently. I'm so grateful. I'm at a company called Storied now, and I love our company already. And one of the things that we're completely remote, and I've been remote for the last few years anyway, so that's not a new change. But I think one of the things that's challenging in this work is the valuation of women, and people don't see the link to that often, so I'll just make it real quick. Like the valuation of women in the workplace is directly tied to whether or not you can displace their value. So if you sexually harass a person who is valuable, you're more likely to get in trouble for it. You wouldn't do it as much if they were valuable. So the valuation of women is important. Anyways, I just got hired, and in my hiring process, you go through the negotiation back and forth about salary, and my first question back was, are the women at my level paid the same amount as me? And their response was, yes, thank you for asking. And I'm convinced that is one of the reasons that I got this job. Like, just being present with, I'm aware that there's often an inequity, and I want to be a part of the solution, and they saw that as an understanding of leadership. Like, that's what it should be. And I think we're in an age now, I hope we're approaching an age where that is going to become the norm.
Something about the collapse of the walls between work and home now, and the fact that we're on calls in front of our kids and our partners. And I've seen a couple posts about how men are overhearing how the women in their lives are treated or spoken to or spoken over. And it reminds me of those kind of, I don't know if you all remember that internet meme about that small company where the woman was having such a hard time with a big client, and he was berating her in email, and finally she let her boss, who was a man, pretend to be her through her email account to see the treatment. And it wasn't until he disclosed that he was Matt instead of Michelle or whatever that the client behaved. But it took that level of kind of proofing out to the boss that changes were made. And everyone on the internet loved this, but I remember tweeting that we shouldn't need Matt to validate her experience to believe her, right? And so I think there's something interesting happening in that our households are now kind of a little window into our workplaces. And I'm hopeful that some of the men that are listening might have women in their lives or in their homes, maybe even teenage daughters in like online education, and might even hear a little bit of this. Because back to the beginning of this conversation when I talked about that elephant on Madison Avenue, the fact that the stats were so staggering to men shows that in a way this might be breaking down some of the privacy and walls that keep men from knowing and hearing and witnessing. And hopefully, to Dale's point, they'll actually get involved. I'd love for us to end with just maybe each of us talking about like what our hopes for around the next year to beyond around this issue to eradicate and minimize. My hope is that we educate, and by the way, a lot of us live in households with teenagers or maybe even middle schoolers that are old enough to start having this conversation about all the things we've discussed tonight, like what does responsible bystander look like, whether you're male or female, and gender representation, like how do we want to conduct ourselves. So that's my hope, is that we all continue to educate and create safe spaces for open conversation. But I'd love for the rest of the panelists to chime in about what our hopes are and what mechanisms are available to realize those hopes.
My hope still so very much lies in the thing you founded your organization on, which is we have to be hiring. We have to be changing the balance of employees in our agencies. We have to be creating environments, using this pandemic as a starting point for creating a work lifestyle that allows more people, particularly women, to not feel like they're at a disadvantage before they even walk in the door and then begin apologizing from there. The more underrepresented people we see in our agencies, the more there are no quiet little back corners where this can happen. There are no audiences that will feel like they're part of a club that has to look the other way. The more we get rid of the club, the better it's going to be. And so my hope is that with this new focus, with the amount of advertising we're seeing out in the world that is speaking to people of different genders, different race, that we're going to see a shift in this industry that takes it out of male domination to the point where we don't have to create so many checks and balances, because it just exists. And I'm going to do everything I can to see if we can get more people into the work.
I love both of those, and I'll just add that my hope is that we can continue to support folks feeling not alone. I think to your point, Colleen, of wrapping the arms around folks, that we need to make sure we know that while we're working on ending sexual harassment, we know that it's going to happen. And when it is, people need to have supportive resources. They need to have a network around them. They need to have folks surrounding them in so many ways, so that when folks do hit this, as unfortunately it's not going to end tomorrow, that their financial, their mental health, the components of their well-being are not as negatively impacted as they have been to date. Because we have to make sure that people can thrive beyond when this happens, if it does.
Yeah, I've been saying this for a long time, and people think I'm crazy, but I don't think it's out of left field to say that we could reduce sexual violence and sexual harassment down to basically statistical non-significance. I mean, we could end sexism in a generation or two, like in our lifetimes. But we have to get off the sidelines. We have to sing together as a choir. And we got to get strategic. I think your point, Kat, about let's start changing this number. Let's change this number. How do we do that? Let's study it. Let's fix it. If we can change this number, it has categorical effects. And so I see a time in the future when there's a healthy masculinity because there's a healthy concept of gender, and we're doing it together.
I was going to say that it's my hope that more victims, more men, more women who experience this in the workplace come forward and say something, because accountability matters. It really does. The only way that you're able to curb bad behavior or nip it in the bud is if the company's aware of the problem in the first place. In fact, when you look at, from a legal perspective, when you look at cases, reporting the problem is one of the first barriers of entry into court. If you allow it to go on for a long time and you never really say anything, it's very difficult to prosecute that case in court and file your civil rights claims and things like that. The burden, the onus is on the person to really report it. But the reason why it's so important to do that is because, one, it puts everybody on notice. Two, it makes others who are undergoing the abuse comfortable in coming forward to say the same thing. And three, accountability really matters. It's one of the best ways in which we deter future bad behavior. So the more people who come out and say, hey, this is what happened to me and it was wrong, and I'm filing a complaint, I'm going to HR, I'm filing an EEOC claim, the more you get less of this behavior, because you'll find that a lot of the bad actors are usually people who have done it before, but no one has ever checked them. No one has ever held them accountable. That's my experience in representing a lot of people in these kinds of cases, is that it's you, and usually when you go through discovery, usually you find that there have been other complaints lodged against this person, or it was sort of the talk among other employees. Other people knew that this person was just as bad, but no one ever came forward and filed a formal complaint or what have you. So that's my hope.
I love your viewpoint, Midwin, about the sooner people raise their voices, the sooner this behavior gets curtailed. And that's a beautiful way to end. But I just want to say this has been a very meaningful conversation. And this feels so important and so kind of culture shaping. So thank you to everyone that tuned in, to my co-panelists that shared their viewpoints. Cindy, Gallop, thank you for chiming in. You're always such an incredible invigorator of like the heart of the matter. And thank you to Fishbowl for inviting us all. This is a great film that I've really enjoyed the all audio. I love not having to have my hair done and
in my pajamas.